So I want to introduce the idea of a moderator variable and the idea of a mediator variable. Sometimes you'll run into terms like moderation analysis or a moderating effect. And likewise, sometimes you'll see a mediator analysis or a mediating effect. So it'll be helpful to have at least a high-level overview of these very distinct ideas of mediation or moderation. And let's start with moderation. So imagine you're searching Google Scholar for some scientific articles on a topic of interest like trauma, and you run into this article: Sense of humor as a moderator of the relation between stressful events and psychological distress. What does that mean exactly? Well, let's break the title down into parts. It talks in there specifically about a relationship between stressful events and psychological distress. That makes sense. We can easily imagine stressful or traumatic events causing distress. And let's imagine some past research has confirmed that this link is causal, that the stressors are actually creating distress, not just correlated with it. But what the title of this paper is implying is that sense of humor does something to the relationship here. They say sense of humor as a moderator of the relation. So we might put that here in our little hypothetical model of causation. By saying it's a moderator, we're saying that if humor is present, this relationship is maybe interrupted or lessened, whereas without humor, the stressful events have their full strength to cause distress. So in that case, humor is a sort of intermediate variable that can, in this case, turn on or off, or maybe just turn down the relationship of these two other things. That's the idea of a moderator variable. So a moderator is something that acts on the relationship between two variables to change that relationship, to change its direction and or its strength. Really what it does is it qualifies a relationship, saying, oh yeah, this relationship is only true or only strong in some circumstances. Like it's saying the relationship only holds for some people or in certain situations rather than being universal. It's saying the relationship might be stronger or weaker in some cases based on this third thing, the moderator. For example, drug X might provide pain relief for people. That's a relationship, right? A relationship between the drug and pain relief. But let's say it works better for males. In that case, sex is a moderator. In that case, we're not saying that the drug has no effect for females necessarily, but maybe the effect is smaller. So the relationship between drug and pain relief is just moderated by person's sex. Or it could be that it doesn't work at all for females and only for males. That would be another way moderation might look. So imagine, we're investigating how well a new state-level job training program works. We might have run an initial study and shown that it works. The training program leads to higher job performance. Maybe we even ran a proper experimental design, so we're confident that it's causing that job performance. This means we've established a relationship between these two variables, like an independent variable and a dependent variable. But then maybe one of our research interns decides to dive a little deeper into the data or collect some new data and finds a really interesting pattern. That relationship between the training program and job performance is only statistically significant for older people, not for younger people. The younger the people are that we look at, the smaller the effect. But the older the participant, the more it seems to help. So in that case, we would say age is a moderator or a moderating variable. It moderates this training to performance relationship. So age is almost like a dial that turns the relationship up or down depending on someone's value for the age variable. Which also brings up this important point at the bottom, which is that moderators can be quantitative, like age would be if you're measuring it in number of years, or salary would be in dollars, or height in inches, or duration of exposure in minutes, or whatever it is. But it could also be a categorical variable. So it could be something like gender or cultural background or type of car, or even age if you're lumping people into age groups like child versus adult. The important thing is just that it's a variable which influences whether or how much these other two variables are related. So the best way to think of it is like this. You've got an independent variable causing changes in a dependent variable. We first have to have shown that's the case, that one thing causes changes in the other. Then we might establish that the moderator turns that relationship up or down, turns it on or off, or perhaps even reverses it. So the relationship of the IV causing the DV may be true in some cases, but not always true, or might be strong in some cases, but weaker in others. So there's the moderator. We kind of often will diagram it as this kind of intermediate between the two things in our little drawing here. So really a moderator is like saying for whom or under what conditions after you've discovered some other relationship. Like in earlier experiments, we found a causal relationship between a weight loss program and losing weight. But for whom? Under what conditions does this weight loss program work? And maybe we find with further research that motivation is a moderator. So this program only works for those who are high in motivation. Or maybe this program works better for them than those low in motivation. Or maybe we found a relationship between a vegetarian diet and certain health outcomes. But not for everyone, not under all conditions. Maybe something like social support turns out to be a moderator. So this diet only improves health outcomes in those whose close friends and family support their diet, whereas it might have the opposite effect among vegetarians with low social support. Or maybe in the past tests, we've found a relationship between consuming caffeine and sleep problems. That makes sense. Maybe we've published those results, but we keep hearing from some people who say they don't experience that. So we look closer, we collect some more data, we ask about the relationship. For whom or under what conditions? And in this case, maybe time of day is the moderator. Maybe drinking coffee in the morning doesn't lead to sleep problems, but drinking coffee later in the day, like in the afternoon, does. If so, we would say time of day moderates the effect of caffeine on sleep. Now, let's look at a couple more examples, but drawn out graphically. So imagine we're measuring how much people like different foods, say ice cream versus pancakes, right? We're looking for a relationship between type of food, ice cream versus pancake, and enjoyment, how much someone enjoys that. So some foods might be more enjoyable overall. Type of food causes enjoyment. But now consider, when it comes to your preference for, say, ice cream versus pancakes, do you think you would answer the same way if I told you the food item was coming out hot? Like if the food is heated, do you prefer ice cream or pancakes? Or imagine I told you the food would be really cold. Would you prefer ice cream now or pancakes? So we could say temperature is actually a moderator of which of these foods you enjoy. We might even graph it out graphically like this. So on the x-axis on the bottom here, we've got our two food categories. And on the y-axis to the left, that's our dependent variable. Always on the left on the y-axis, we'll put the dependent variable. So how much you enjoy a certain food. But notice we've gone beyond just answering an overall ice cream to pancake preference here. We've graphed it out with an additional factor, an additional variable, which is the temperature of the food. So for cold food, the line is actually reversed compared to the hot food line. Preferences will switch or cross over in this case when the temperature variable is taken into account. So temperature is moderating the relationship. This means moderators are basically interaction effects. As we often find with factorial research designs, one factor's relationship to the dependent variable might depend on some other factor. Here we've got a crossover interaction, so the effect actually reverses when the moderating variable is switched. Or here's another example. Maybe you're trying to figure out how to get your dog to sit. So the proportion of time it spends sitting might be the dependent variable you're interested in. And when you give the verbal command to sit, right? Often, let's say that leads to your dog sitting. So maybe you found some evidence that saying sit causes sitting down behavior. But your partner notices it's not always the case. Like the relationship here between when you say sit and the dog actually sitting is not universal. Like maybe your partner points out that it makes a really big difference if you have a treat in your hand at the time you give the command. So when you do have the treat, the relationship is really strong. When you're not holding a treat, maybe the command pretty much always fails. So your partner has found a moderator here, a variable that moderates the relationship between the command and the behavior that follows it. So graphing out the behavior, we might see something like this. On the x-axis at the bottom, we've got the times you say nothing, kind of a control condition, versus the times you say sit. And for the orange line, those are the times where you didn't have a treat in your hand. So for each of those conditions, sometimes you didn't have a treat in your hand. Notice that saying sit in that case is no better than saying nothing for the orange line. But the command even though it doesn't work in that condition, notice we might find something different with the green line here, which is when you are holding a treat. In that case, the dog is way, way more likely to sit after the command is given compared to not giving a command and saying nothing. So we have an interaction effect. In this case, it's a spreading interaction rather than a crossover interaction. But still, the relationship of the command to the behavior is much stronger or weaker depending on this other factor. That's exactly how we define an interaction effect. I'll give a couple more examples just to make it real clear. Imagine we found a relationship between work experience and salary. More experience tends to lead to more salary. And maybe this relationship is generally true, but we might find that in some circumstances or for some people, it's not as strong of a relationship. Or to take another example, maybe we found that social media usage seems to impact loneliness. Like maybe overall higher usage creates more loneliness in the user. Both of those are just relationships between an IV and a DV. But on further investigation, we might find that a relationship like that isn't the case for everyone. So for some people, work experience and salary are kind of tightly related. There's a big, strong relationship there, and maybe it's a weaker relationship for others. So if there's a gender pay gap, then maybe for men, the work experience salary relationship is smaller than for women. Or for social media usage, we find again that connection between social media usage and loneliness, but it might be that's not for everyone. It's more about who's using it. So maybe we find that it really only creates problems for passive users, like kind of lurkers, right? People who browse a lot but don't themselves post and interact a lot. On the other hand, maybe for more active users, it doesn't create loneliness at all, or not as much. Or maybe even the opposite. Maybe for them it decreases loneliness. If that's the case, then we've found an important moderator of the relationship between social media usage and loneliness. Or another example, imagine there's some chemo drug that's commonly used for a particular cancer, and we know it helps, like it affects whether someone goes into remission. It might not be perfect, but when we randomly assign one group to get this drug and another group to get a placebo treatment, the drug group always does like way, way better. So we've got lots of evidence this chemo drug works, but maybe now as science is getting better and we're entering an era of personalized medicine, we want to know why the drug works for many people but not for everyone. And maybe it turns out that depends on genetics. Maybe people with a particular allele on a particular gene might be much more likely to go into remission with this drug, whereas those with a different allele on that gene, maybe they don't respond very well to this drug. If so, we have found a moderator, a moderating variable. And in fact, an important one, because it means maybe we can find a chemo drug that would work better for these other people. And if so, a genetic test could dictate which treatment we want to apply to future patients whenever we discover this cancer. So you can see how moderators can be a big deal and why we shouldn't always stop at IV causing DV. A moderator can help us find many nuances like those that exist out in the world, the conditional relationships where one thing only has an effect in some cases or for some people, or where an effect is stronger or weaker depending on something else. Now, an important note before we move on. Statistical tests of moderation, they don't establish causation on their own. You still need reason to believe that the IV causes the DV. Like you would still want to run an experimental design where you manipulate the independent variable to be confident it has a causal effect on the dependent variable. But if you're hypothesizing a moderation effect, then in this case, you would do something like a factorial research design, a factorial experiment. You might manipulate the IV while also measuring or manipulating the putative moderator, the extra factor. So for example, if you think that gender is a moderator for whether this new antidepressant will work for people, you are going to test whether the pill leads to improvement, whether the IV leads to the DV by doing an assignment. By doing an experiment, by randomly assigning some people to get the pill and randomly assigning some people to get an inert placebo pill. So that's what makes it an experiment, right? But in this factorial design, you might first start by taking a bunch of men and a bunch of women to begin with. And then among each of those, that's where you're going to split people randomly into pill or placebo. So you're not necessarily, in that case, manipulating gender. You're just measuring that variable, your moderator variable that you think is going on. But at the end of this, you'll be able to see whether the effect exists, the pill to improvement effect, whether it exists only for one gender, or maybe if it's bigger for one gender and smaller for the other. But a factorial design could also be done where you're manipulating both of the factors you're curious about, where you're randomly assigning people to a level on each of the factors. And that can likewise tell you, if a variable moderates the effect of another variable. Like you might be testing whether a type of therapy, like DBT, works better than no therapy for some condition. Perhaps the control group you're comparing to is just a wait list control condition. But in each of those groups, you might also be randomly assigning half of them to take a standard antidepressant at the same time, and the other half to take a placebo pill. So some people are getting therapy plus meds, some people are getting therapy but no meds, some people wait list plus meds, and some people wait list plus no meds. And afterward, you can see if there's an interaction effect. See if taking medication moderates the effect of therapy. Remember, a moderator means an interaction effect. And this is totally distinct from a very similar term you might hear a lot, which is mediator, a mediating variable, which is different. So imagine you're browsing Google Scholar one day. You're looking for research related to, let's say, sexuality and depression. And you come across this cross-cultural article that has found a disparity in depressive symptoms between heterosexual and sexual minority men, in this case in China. Basically, in their Chinese sample, they found higher levels of depression in sexual minority men. But they went further and they found what seems to be an explanation for why that's the case. So in this article, they're proposing the reason there's that connection is because of less social support. In other words, they think that the sexuality itself isn't causing depression, but rather the sexuality difference, the sexual minority status, that leads to less social support. And that is what really causes the depression. So as it says in the kind of highlighted box at the bottom here, overall, sexual orientation and social support, they both predicted depressive symptoms. But different from previous studies in Western countries, in our results, they say, social support fully mediates, but does not moderate, the relationship between sexual orientation and depressive symptoms in Chinese men. Which is quite the mouthful, it has some technical language in there, but when they say social support fully mediates the relationship between sexual orientation and depression, they're saying social support is the specific way that sexuality is influencing depression there. That social support is sort of the real variable behind the scenes. It's the intervening variable that's actually having the effect on depression. It is how sexuality leads to depression in China, in this sample. So we might visualize it like this. This is from the article itself. Ignore the little labels and numbers on the lines for a moment and just look at the boxes. We have a relationship between sexual orientation and depressive symptoms. Like, say we're confident already from past research that we know sexual orientation actually causes depression to be higher in that sample, in that country. So the bottom arrow, that's a relationship that maybe we know exists. In the study we just read about a second ago, they proposed this model that you see here, where a third variable, social support, is an intervening variable, what we might call a mediating variable, meaning it underlies the relationship that we see at the bottom between orientation and depression. So you've got the arrow from orientation also going up to social support, meaning the model they're proposing, the model proposes that minority sexual orientation actually causes a drop-off in social support for these Chinese men. And then you've got another arrow going down from social support to depression, meaning that their model proposes getting rid of social support increases depression, or lowering social support leads to more depression. It's a way of explaining the arrow on the bottom row by explaining how that relationship happens. So now the little labels, if you're curious, the numbers on the arrows, that relates to statistically testing the direction and magnitude of those relationships. Like path A has a negative direction, a negative correlation, meaning minority orientation goes along with decreased social support. And path B likewise has a negative direction, a negative correlation, meaning decreased social support goes along with increased depression, or increased social support, on the other hand, would go along with decreased depression. That's the idea of a negative correlation. They kind of go opposites. And then the little asterisks here, those are commonly used in graphs and stuff in articles. They show statistical significance, that we're confident it's a real relationship in each case. So when they found something like that in their study, they had found a mediator between orientation and depression, a mediating variable or a mediating relationship. So a mediator variable is something between the independent variable and the dependent variable that explains how the IV influences the DV. A mediation model basically proposes that the IV influences the mediator, which in turn, the mediator is influencing the DV. So it's saying there's a causation link from the IV to the mediator and then another causation link from the mediator to the DV. Basically, it's clarifying the specific nature of the IV to DV relationship, saying it goes through this intermediate step. And this is key, if the mediation model is true, if it's really happening because of this mediator, then removing the mediator should remove at least some, perhaps even all, of the effect of the independent variable. Now you often see it diagrammed out like this. So even though we might already have found a relationship between the IV and the DV, and we can quantify that, we are now modeling what we think is really going on behind the scenes, with the A path being the independent variable affecting the mediator variable, and the B path being the mediator affecting the dependent variable. As always, we have to test statistically to see if the data fits with our model and is statistically significant. But this is kind of the concept behind it. And just to be clear from the start here, statistical tests of mediation don't establish causation on their own. You still need reason to believe the IV causes the mediator and that the mediator causes the DV. So ideally, you'd test this kind of thing using an experimental design where you're actually manipulating the variables, like manipulate the mediator variable. Sometimes you actually see this called an experimental causal chain design because you're using experimental design to test that proposed causal chain, that chain of causation. Of course, though, we can't always do that. We can't always carry out experiments. It's sometimes just not ethical or not possible, in which case we may be looking only at correlational data. In that case, we have to be very careful when interpreting the results of a mediation analysis where the variables were all just measured rather than randomly assigned and manipulated. In that case, you would need some other outside independent reason to believe the IV is causing the mediator and that the mediator is causing the DV, beyond just the statistics of a mediation analysis, beyond just the stats telling you that each of these paths are significantly correlated. But for now, let's just look at some more examples of mediation effects, kind of the concept of it, and we'll just assume for these we've found a way to confirm that the pathways in the model are genuine causation and not just correlations. So imagine we've known for a while that job overload leads to health problems, like higher rates of heart attack and such. We have an IV here on the left and a DV on the right, and again, we'll pretend past research has convinced us that the IV is actually causing the DV. But how exactly does job overload lead to health problems? At that point, we've got to kind of speculate or hypothesize about some possible ways to explain that. And one that might come to your mind is stress. Like job overload leading to stress, that makes a lot of sense. And we certainly know from decades of research that too much stress can lead to some health problems. So we've got this hypothetical model here that we might propose that would help explain the earlier connection we found between the IV and the DV. So this model is our hypothesis. So then we'd test it. We'd see if indeed stress explains the connection. So what we would do is check if the A path is statistically significant, which basically just means checking if they are correlated. Do those with the highest job overload have the highest stress? We would also check the B pathway. Is there a significant correlation between stress and health problems in our study? So you establish that piece of the connection as well. And if we've gotten that far, it's at least plausible that job overload might be leading to stress and that stress might be leading to health problems. Again, we haven't established causation just by finding these correlations, but it at least is plausible. It's one possibility here is this model. But there's also one final crucial step, which is we want to go back to the original connection, the path at the bottom here, and see if that connection between overload and health problems is now weaker or disappears once we take those top pathways, A and B, into account. So this requires a bit of fancy math. Basically, it's a kind of a simple regression model if the relations are linear here, but we're not going to get into the math of it. Just understand that we need to show that once the top paths, A and B, are taken into account, then there is less or no other connection going on between the IV and the DV. Like, statistically, you want to find no remaining connection between them, or at least much weaker of a connection once A and B are accounted for. Or once the effects of stress are removed, you want to see that job overload doesn't have such a connection to health problems. So technically we would do some other checks too, and like I said before, you want to provide some independent evidence that these connections are causation and not just correlational. If all you're doing is measuring the variables, all you have is correlation, which doesn't make for a very strong causation model. But at least if you find statistically significant results for an analysis like this, a mediation analysis for these paths in your model, you found something that is what we would expect if the model is true. Doesn't prove the model is true. We need some other reason to think it's causation, but at least fits with this possibility. So let's see another example of mediation. We might find that students who attended our study skills workshop tend to do much better on the exam later. Perhaps we could even do an experimental design where we take 100 volunteers, we randomly assign 50 to attend our study skills workshop, and 50 of them to watch some boring video the same length that has nothing to do with studying. Basically just a control group. Maybe when doing that, we find that the study skills workshop indeed does cause better exam scores. Right? If we did an experiment, we could say, yeah, this is causation evidence. But we still might ask, how? Like, how does it lead to those improvements? And that is where a mediation model might come in. So someone might propose a potential intervening variable, a mediating variable, to make this all make sense. So perhaps they think it's enhanced study techniques. That's the mediating variable. So if that ends up being true, if this model is correct, then what we're saying is that sitting in the workshop doesn't directly make the scores better, but what it does is leads to better study techniques, like, ditching the highlighter and using more empirically supported study strategies. And then that in turn is what leads to better exam scores. Or maybe this example. Let's say we've shown that exercise leads to lower depression. Like, you can randomly assign some people to an exercise condition and other people to not exercise, and sure enough, we find that the IV does seem to cause the DV. This is in fact a real and well-studied effect. But it doesn't necessarily tell us how exercise does this, like why exercise works for depression. There might be a few different proposals, but let's say one of the researchers suggests this model, where they think the link is endorphins. They propose that endorphins might be a mediator between exercise and depression. So when you exercise, endorphins, these endogenous morphines, are released in increased amounts in the brain. We know that. And then in turn, this person is proposing that endorphins lower depression. So this is a proposed model, right? A mediation model. We would still need to test the model. Like, for one thing, we would want to be sure that endorphins really do lower depression. If that's the case, then we should be able to inject people with endorphins or similar substances like exogenous morphine-like medication or something, and show that depression goes down when we do that. But we also want to show that exercise leads to endorphin release, which, we might already have some evidence of that, so this model might already sound pretty plausible from the start. But what we want to do for a mediation analysis here is collect data on all of these things in one single study. So then we can check path A and confirm in our sample that exercise is statistically linked, correlated to endorphins in a statistically significant way. And then we go and we check path B and we confirm endorphins are linked to lower depression in our study. But also, we need to do that crucial last step and confirm that when we take those links, A and B, into account, the direct link between exercise and depression kind of decreases or fades out. That it doesn't add a big effect on its own above and beyond the endorphin effect. If there's no real effect left over beyond the endorphins, then we might say we've got pretty much complete mediation here. But it's also possible to find what we call partial mediation, which is where the endorphin, the kind of causal pathway of the endorphins, that might explain part of the IV to DV connection here, but there might be other mediators out there which we haven't thought of in addition. And you can see these kinds of mediation models all the time out there because often it's easy to find a connection between two things, to find that an IV affects a DV, but it's a little harder to dig in and explicate exactly how it does that. So it's easy to find a correlation between socioeconomic status and child reading ability. And we might even find some ways to argue that this is a causal link, not just correlation. But even if we are confident that SES causes child reading ability, that still doesn't tell us how. You can't just insert dollar bills into a book and the money makes you read it better. So how does being better off make kids read better? And what we might find when we do a mediation analysis, we might find parental education level is the real explanation here. That might be what's mediating this relationship we spotted before. In fact, if this model is correct, it could be that having more money doesn't do anything for child reading in a direct way. It might just be that the parents had more opportunity themselves to get educated because of their SES, and it's the parents' education that affects the kids' reading ability. In other words, SES would only be an indirect cause in that model. Of course, the model could be wrong. We might find that parental education level doesn't affect child reading ability. The B path might not be significant. Or maybe this model does work. We check it out and we do find an effect of the mediation model and we say, oh yes, parental education level is a mediator. But there might still be some independent connection between SES and reading ability even after parental education is taken into account. So some other effect above and beyond that. Maybe SES means, money for tutoring, and tutoring is another mediating variable for how SES could connect to child reading ability. But the point is, when we're thinking about mediators and modeling out mediator models like this, we're basically saying the independent variable is only an indirect cause, and we are proposing an intermediate connection between the IV and the DV. All right, we'll stop there, but just keep in mind, anytime you see terms like mediator or moderator in a research article or an abstract or in some science news, you can at least have a feel for what they're talking about now, even if the actual statistical testing is a little beyond your training. So if you read someone talking about a mediator, they're proposing an intervening variable for how an IV is affecting a DV. And if you read someone talking about a moderator, they're proposing an interaction effect, a third variable that turns on or off, up or down, some connection between an IV and a DV. And in both cases, you'll often see these models tested statistically, like a moderation analysis or a mediation analysis. But keep in mind, that by itself is not enough to be confident of causation, especially if all they did was measure all of the variables. So we would also need some independent evidence that the links here are causal rather than just correlational in order to fully confirm these models as an accurate description of the real world and what causes what.